Al Jazeera Podcasts.
Today, as the bombing stops, a new crackdown in Iran begins.
We're seeing basically an intensification of the most repressive aspects of the government that were already in place and now getting worse.
Iran's government is calling it a victory, but many Iranians are still mourning and now face arrests, fear, and uncertainty. I'm Manuel Rápalo, and this is The Take. As a ceasefire holds, Iranians are trying to rebuild their lives after nearly 2 weeks of fighting. In those 2 weeks, Israel's attacks killed more than 600 people in Iran.
In the middle of the night, June the 13th, that week, something unusual is going on. We could hear an airplane flying over the city with some anti-craft shootings going on. We turned on the phone satellites. We understood Israel invaded Iran surprisingly. We couldn't believe this might be Israel alone to invade Iran on that scale, and that might have been helped by the United States or some other countries.
One Iranian citizen in Tehran spoke to us about his experience. He asked to stay anonymous, but said even as the ceasefire was announced, he felt doubtful it would hold.
When ceasefire was announced by the American president, immediately everybody started to think, what is going on? We were skeptical, first of all, about the start of the war, and secondly, about the sudden ceasefire, because we believe this is going to be a kind of conspiracy going on.
He says his skepticism comes from his distrust of U.S. President Donald Trump's promises after the U.S. attack on Iran.
We believe they haven't kept their own promises. Like Donald Trump, he said we have 2 weeks to think about, and suddenly after 2 days they invaded Iran. And this ceasefire, we believe it is not going to be held. Hopefully it is, but we don't believe that.
For more perspective on how Iranians are doing, we spoke with a journalist who has also been covering the conflict since the start and speaking with other Iranians there.
My name is Alex Shams, and I'm an anthropologist and a writer.
Alex, welcome to The Take. It's nice to see you. Let's start with June the 13th. It's a day that we covered very closely here on the show and on Al Jazeera, but I'd like to know what that day was like for Iranians who lived it.
Israel's attack on Iran came as a complete surprise, really, for people who were inside of Iran. The United States and Iran were in the middle of negotiations. They were due to meet on Sunday. And then on Friday morning, basically, bombs started raining down across Tehran. People I spoke to on the ground really expressed that they had no idea what was going on. They heard booms, they heard explosions, there were bright lights flashing. And I think a lot of people really couldn't believe that it was war until the explosions kind of kept going, until they woke up and they started to see sirens everywhere. And that's when kind of images really started to flood in of where the bombs had hit. And the missiles that were fired and the drone explosions, they hit across residential neighborhoods. So some people experienced this firsthand by bombs that hit their buildings. But I think for most people, it was experienced as this kind of mysterious loud booms. And then kind of a sinking awareness that some kind of war was starting. And the first day of explosions that morning, really, there were several rounds of attacks. Israel said it was targeting military commanders or it was hitting certain leaders from the Revolutionary Guards, but the missiles were really hitting their apartments and killing them, their families, and often their neighbors as well. And so there were dozens of people killed that first day. Hundreds more were injured. And I think for Iranians, that morning was one of complete shock, but also disbelief. I think most people really didn't think that a war was really starting the way that we now know it was. The year before, Israel had launched missile strikes on Iran that were one-off. And so I think a lot of people really thought this was going to be a short one-off attack. And were really shocked when throughout the day it continued. In the evening, it continued even worse. And then continued, 2 or 3 more days after that, before it really started to sink in that this was a full war and that people needed to evacuate and flee the city.
And I think part of that disbelief that we keep hearing from people in Iran, especially from young people who have been speaking out on social media about what happened, has to do with the fact that Iran hasn't experienced anything like this since the 1980s. You've been speaking to many people on the ground who have been sharing these types of experiences with you. One of those stories is that of a 35-year-old English teacher in Iran. Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, so Since the beginning of Israel's attack, I've been talking to people across Tehran. I lived there for a number of years, and so I have contacts there. I did research there for a long time. And I think for most people, it almost unfolded the same way the first day, including for that English teacher that I spoke to. This kind of just terror of being woken up at night and not really knowing what was happening, and followed by just being awake and being afraid. I believe that she was in the middle of her morning prayers when the attack began. And I think that she thought that there was like construction or some noise from the street that was happening. But then as the explosions got stronger, got harder, it became clear that something was really wrong. Something else was happening. And in this kind of situation where there's this shock war that starts. No one knows what's coming. The people were taken aback. There wasn't really a sense the first day of any clear messaging of how people should be preparing for what's about to happen. Are they supposed to go out to grocery stores and stock up on food? What kind of conflict this was going to be?
Yeah, the initial images that we saw from June 13th really painted a picture of absolute chaos, confusion, people worried about what would happen next. It seemed like it was not ending, but that was then. Let's fast forward to where we are now, and it's been a couple of weeks now since the bombs fell, killing more than 600 people in Iran. Now there's the ceasefire. What's the feeling like on the ground right now? What can you tell us about how people are starting to recover?
I think there's really this kind of relief on the ground right now. People are really kind of breathing a sigh of relief that this has paused, that it's ended. People, I think, are unsure if it's paused or if it's ended. And I think at first it was almost like waking up from a nightmare. That's often what I heard from people, that they couldn't believe it was over, and that they had basically just experienced this collective trauma. And I think it's important to think about it like that too, because this was 12 days of constant warfare, of fear. Millions of people were displaced. The people who were unable to leave their homes lived in fear that they would be bombed at any time. And on top of that, you have tens of thousands of people, I think, who lost their homes, just given the scale of the bombardment. There's a building not far from where my grandmother lives that the building was struck, I think, to target one person who was inside. The entire building collapsed as a result of the strike. And that was a 14-story building. I'd thought that 60 people perished in the rubble. People are waking up to rubble on their streets. And I mean, the destruction that's really unfolded has been much, much more widespread that's been reported. And even the 600 count for the death toll, I think, is a major undercount. In the days since the end of the ceasefire, there are still people being pulled from the rubble. There are bodies being found every day. And a lot of the destruction that's happened, it was very difficult for ambulances and rescue teams to kind of reach the people who were underneath the rubble.
Can I say something? Because like there's something that happens in these situations where it catches people by surprise. They're suddenly living the worst moment of their lives. And then you see something beautiful that sort of comes out of that, which is people coming together to help each other. And I know that that's something that you've also been paying close attention to. Can you share some of those stories of how people have come together to sort of help each other out in Iran?
Definitely. So I think just as Israel has kind of rained terror down from the sky, on the ground, Iranians have really, really come together. We've seen it across the spectrum in terms of people opening their houses to the displaced, people offering rides to people who don't have cars to get out of the city, restaurants and cafes and shops kind of giving free food and water. And some of these are really spontaneous acts of solidarity. There's stories of people, for example, being lined at the bakery and realizing that there's not enough bread to go around, and instead of fighting over the bread or only giving it to the people who are first in line, really distributing it equally among the people who are there. So some of it's spontaneous, but there's also these pre-existing mutual aid networks where people have been looking out for each other, taking care of people's elderly relatives who have been left behind. And I think for me, not only for me, I think for Iranians, that was also really important to see that after years of efforts to divide Iranians, both by their own government as well as through Israeli propaganda or from foreign satellite channels, this effort to kind of turn people against each other or see each other as enemies. What we saw in the conflict is that people really came together to help each other in ways that went, from the spontaneous to the organized, but were really meaningful in terms of ensuring that there was a sense of social solidarity in a very difficult time.
More with Alex after the break. Alex, I want to ask you about where this leaves Iran right now. Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, has considered this a victory.
I feel it is necessary to offer congratulations to the great nation of Iran. I extend several congratulations to the people. One is for the victory over the fake Zionist regime. Despite all the noise and all the claims, the Zionist regime was nearly brought to its knees and crushed under the blows of the Islamic Republic.
How is that narrative landing with the people in Iran? Does it feel like a victory to the average Iranian?
I think it's a tough question because everyone is experiencing this really differently, right? If you lost a family member, if you were injured, if you lost your home, this war is going to feel different than if you weren't affected as directly. But it's also going to feel different based on what your politics were beforehand. And so I think for people who are closer to the government line or they're supportive of the government line, they I think believe or are recognizing this as a victory to a certain extent for the reasons that the government is saying, which is that, let's look at it from their perspective for a moment. Two nuclear armed powers, some of the strongest militaries on earth, launched a war on Iran in which they said that the goal was to collapse the regime. At times, they both floated regime change as a possibility. Trump said that he would only stop when there was absolute surrender from Iran, and Iran didn't surrender. The government was able to respond throughout the conflict. It was able to degrade air defenses in Israel and continue launching conflict. The way that the Iranian government narrated this conflict from the beginning was that they would respond in kind to Israeli provocations. And so when Israel hit Iran's state media broadcaster while it was on the air, the next day Iran said, we're going to hit Israel's state media. And so in the way that Israel was committing war crimes, the Iranian government said, every time you do one, we'll do one back. And they very much framed it like that. And I think for a lot of people, there's a sense that Iran did come out stronger and the government did come out stronger. There's a vocal segment of the Iranian population, many Iranians who are extremely critical of their government, who want major changes. We've seen that over the last years and for decades, people protesting and marching, demanding a very different kind of political situation, expansion of democracy, expansion of civil rights.
Let's stay on that theme a little bit and the role of activism in Iran today, the voices of dissent in Iran today, because on the one hand, like we've been talking about on this episode, Iranians are trying to recover, they're trying to rebuild, and while they're trying to rebuild, they are now starting to deal with this crackdown by the Iranian government, by their own government. Can you talk about that sort of political climate that has started to simmer in the days and weeks now after June 13th?
Definitely. I think that's the saddest part, is that we're seeing basically an intensification of the most repressive aspects of the government that were already in place, and now getting worse. Now they have a really good excuse to crack down on people. And so we're seeing hundreds and hundreds of people being detained. There have already been executions. I think there's going to be more in the future. There's this sense as well that the government wants to really show with an iron fist that it is in control, and that the people who for 10 days thought that, maybe the government was going to fall, or that they could just, expect Israel to come and bomb them and then that they would be able to overthrow the government really easily. I think that is what the government is now trying to make a clear sign to people inside the country that that's not going to happen. I think the crackdown is the best example of how Israel's war really was counterproductive in terms of helping Iranians secure their freedom. The war really reinforced the state's narrative that There are outside forces who are going to attack at any moment, that we have to constantly be on the defensive, and that any kind of force inside demanding freedom or political change could potentially be a fifth column for outside invaders. And from the beginning of this conflict, Israel has boasted of having an extensive Mossad network inside of Iran. And so from the first day of the war, the Iranian government began cracking down. It began looking for the people who were working with Israel. And this really fell on the most marginalized and discriminated communities in Iran already. So the arrests that have happened since, there have been hundreds of people arrested on suspicion of collaboration with Israel. And those arrests have been concentrated among the Kurdish community, which is particularly the Kurdish communities that were really active in the woman life freedom struggle. And so those regions really are feeling now the repression. The suspicion has also fallen on Afghan refugees. Besides Iranians, there's 3 to 5 million Afghans who live in Iran, and they are discriminated against legally. They have access to certain services, but for example, they can't move between cities without permission. So during the war, they were trapped under the bombs. And there have been incidences of Afghans being arrested, of being followed by police on suspicion of giving intel to Israel. And so what we're really seeing is this nightmare scenario that Iranian civil society activists have been warning about for years, which is that if there's a war on Iran, it'll actually strengthen the government's position by validating their fears that there are people inside of the country who are trying to overthrow them with Israel and the United States' help, which is exactly what protest movements and civil society within Iran have tried so far to say that is not what they're doing.
But because of what you're describing, this is still something that is being lived. People are still trying to recover, and they're doing this in this sort of very tense political climate. How is that impacting people's efforts to just get their lives back together?
I think it really adds to the uncertainty and to the fear, because thinking about this as a collective trauma, out of nowhere a war began, out of nowhere it stopped. People are really unsure if this is real, if it could start again, if the missiles could start falling at any time. I think one of the scariest things is really thinking about this also as creating a precedent, right? This idea that surprise wars are now something that have been totally normalized. Israel just launched one. Most of the global north really stood behind it. The United States decided to get in on the action in what was a completely unprovoked assault on Iran. And this sense of uncertainty, this fear that at any moment bombs could start falling, at any moment a war could start again, I think that really, really undermines people's sense of safety. And the fact that that the government is also taking advantage of this to say, we need to crack down, this is just like the worst case scenario. And we saw this during the war too, where, like, for example, Israel bombed Evin prison. It said that it was trying to symbolically show that it was trying to help free Iranians. But what it actually did was hurt and potentially kill prisoners, as well as families that had come to visit them, people who were there to pay bail to get their loved ones out. And in the name of freeing Iranians, they ended up killing people who just happened to be by the prison, close to the prison, or in the lobby of the prison. And I think this is a really apt metaphor if we think about the terror of being in a cage while bombs are falling, not being able to escape, and then having the person who says they're trying to free you actually killing you.
It's so interesting that you bring that up. That's an example that I heard from Professor Hamid Dabashi, who we had on the show just very recently, talking about Iran and public perception, and this idea that two relatively young countries of the world, the United States and Israel, could think that they could bomb their way into changing hearts and minds in Iran. But finally, Alex, you mentioned that you grew up visiting Iran, that you even lived there briefly in your time. You still report stories from Iran, in a country that has such a long political memory spanning centuries. What is that lasting memory going to be now from the destruction that we've seen in just the last few weeks?
I think we're really going to see that Israel and America's war on Iran is going to be added to this list of events where foreign powers have betrayed and undermined the Iranian people's struggle for freedom. We've seen this from the Iranian constitutional revolution in the early 20th century, when Britain and Russia intervened to kind of stop this democratization process. We saw it in 1953 when the CIA led a coup against the democratically elected government of Mohammad Mossadegh, and then proceeded to put the Shah back on the throne and supported the dictator for decades. States. And I think now we have this great new example. By great, I mean this terrible new example of how the world can launch a war, kill hundreds of people, and basically no one will intervene to stop them. If you can be attacked at any time and the world community won't raise a finger to stop it, then you have to always be prepared for war. And that's a terrible world to live in. I don't think Iranians should live in that world. I don't think anyone should live in that world. And we've seen this genocide unfolding over the last years in Gaza. We saw Israel commit war crimes in Lebanon. Now we just saw it attack in a completely unprovoked way another country for 2 weeks. This is I think these are terrible precedents for the world that we live in. And it's not only Iranians who are going to remember this. The entire world is watching. And the entire world, I think, is scared of what Israel is getting away with and what the U.S. is doing as well.
Alex Shams, thank you so much for joining us today on The Take. Good to see you.
Thanks for having me.
And that's The Take. We'd love to hear your thoughts and questions about today's episode. So let's keep the conversation going. And if you haven't yet, make sure to subscribe to the Al Jazeera English channel to get all the latest. Hit that subscribe button. See you tomorrow.